The restaurant was packed, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the rich aroma of expensive meals. But at one table, something was wrong. Ethan Carter had been sitting there for nearly 30 minutes, completely ignored. Waitresses walked past him like he didn't exist. Orders were taken from other tables, drinks were refilled, smiles were given, but not to him. And then when he finally tried to get service, the waitress looked him up and down and said, "Maybe this place isn't for you." She had no idea who she was talking to. She had no idea that the man she just humiliated had the power to destroy everything. And by the time she realized it, it was already too late. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The restaurant was buzzing with the usual crowd, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of conversation. It was the kind of place where people came to celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, and special occasions. The warm lighting made everything feel elegant, and the scent of grilled steak and fresh bread filled the air. The waitstaff moved quickly, dressed in crisp uniforms, balancing trays of expensive dishes while customers chatted over their meals. Among them was Ethan Carter, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in a simple but neat outfit, sitting alone at a corner table. He had been there for nearly 15 minutes, yet no one had come to take his order. Across the room, Lauren Mitchell, one of the senior waitresses, walked past his table for the third time, pretending not to see him. Her sharp heels clicked against the wooden floor as she smiled at a couple seated just a few feet away. She leaned over, taking their order with ease, laughing at the man's joke and nodding politely as she jotted down their requests. When she turned around, her eyes met Ethan's for a brief second before she looked away and walked in the opposite direction. He sighed and adjusted his menu, wondering if she simply hadn't noticed him or if there was something more to it. Ethan watched as other customers, who had arrived after him, were greeted with warm smiles and quick service. His patience was starting to wear thin, but he kept his expression neutral. He had been to this restaurant before and had never experienced anything like this. He glanced around, hoping to catch another server's attention, but they were all too busy, except for Lauren, who stood by the counter, chatting with another waitress, Madison Clark. After another 5 minutes, he raised his hand slightly, signaling for service. Lauren turned her head and sighed before finally walking toward him. She crossed her arms as she stopped at his table, her voice flat and uninterested. "What do you need?" Lauren asked, barely making eye contact. Ethan looked at her, slightly taken aback by the tone. "I'd like to order, if that's okay," he said politely. She exhaled, as if he had just asked her to do something unbearable. "We're really busy right now. You'll have to wait." He glanced around the restaurant. Every other table was being served without delay. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I've been waiting for quite a while. I just need a menu recommendation and a drink." Lauren rolled her eyes and let out a small laugh. "Maybe this place isn't the right fit for you," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. Ethan's expression didn't change, but inside something shifted. He had dealt with attitudes like this before. He knew exactly what was happening. He could feel the glances from the nearby tables, the way some customers stole quick looks at him before turning away, pretending they hadn't noticed. A young waitress named Olivia Daniels stood nearby, overhearing the exchange. She hesitated before stepping forward, looking uncomfortable. "I can take your order," she offered softly, reaching for her notepad. Lauren shot her a glare. "No, you won't." She turned back to Ethan and gave him a forced smile. "Like I said, we're busy." For a second, neither of them moved. Ethan studied her face. The fake politeness stretched across it, the way she clutched the tray in her hands like she was holding on to power. He slowly nodded, pushing his menu aside. That was all the confirmation he needed. Lauren smirked, thinking she had won, before walking away toward another table. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly guessed, was that her shift was about to take a turn she would never forget. Ethan sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. His appetite had faded, replaced by a feeling he knew all too well. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about something bigger. He had been through this kind of situation before. The passive disrespect, The quiet exclusion, the way people like Lauren thought they could decide who belonged and who didn't. But what she didn't know was that her actions were being noticed. Across the restaurant, Richard Bennett, the general manager, leaned against the bar counter, watching. He hadn't heard the full conversation, but he had seen enough. He had watched Lauren skip over Ethan's table 3 times. He had seen how quickly she moved to serve other customers, offering them bright smiles while barely acknowledging Ethan's presence. Something about it didn't sit right with him. Richard turned to Madison Clark, one of the other waitresses standing nearby. "Has that gentleman over there been helped?" he asked, nodding toward Ethan. Madison hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Lauren was supposed to take his table," she mumbled. Richard's jaw tightened. "And did she?" Madison glanced at Lauren, who was now happily chatting with a group of customers at another table. She looked back at Richard and sighed. "Not really." Richard straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "I see." Meanwhile, Olivia was still standing near Ethan's table, unsure of what to do. She wanted to help, but Lauren had made it clear that she shouldn't interfere. She chewed on her lip, then made a decision. She grabbed a menu and stepped forward. "Sir, I'd be happy to take your order," she said, offering Ethan a small but sincere smile. Ethan met her gaze and gave her a nod. "I appreciate that." Before he could say more, Lauren suddenly appeared again, stepping between them like a barrier. "What are you doing?" she hissed at Olivia under her breath. Olivia blinked. "Taking his order, like I should have done 10 minutes ago." Lauren's face darkened. "We're not wasting time on tables that don't—" She caught herself mid-sentence and quickly shut her mouth, but the damage was already done. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "That don't what?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was something behind it, something Lauren wasn't expecting. Lauren clenched her jaw. "Never mind," she muttered, turning on her heel. "Do whatever you want." She stormed off toward the kitchen, her grip on her tray so tight her knuckles turned white. Madison, who had been watching from behind the counter, shook her head and whispered under her breath, "She's really pushing it this time." Richard had seen and heard enough. His patience was gone. He stepped away from the bar and started walking toward Ethan's table. Lauren still had no idea, but she was about to find out. Lauren stormed into the kitchen, her frustration bubbling over. She tossed her tray onto the counter, letting out an annoyed sigh. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Behind her, Jason Wells, the head chef, glanced up from the grill. "What's your problem now?" he asked, flipping a steak onto a sizzling plate. Lauren scoffed, crossing her arms. "That guy at table 7, sitting there like he owns the place, expecting everyone to drop what they're doing to serve him." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You mean the guy who's been waiting longer than anyone else?" Lauren shot him a glare. "Oh, come on. You know how this works. This is a high-end restaurant. We have an image to maintain." Jason turned back to the grill, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making the wrong kind of impression." Before Lauren could snap back, the kitchen door swung open. Richard Bennett stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Lauren," he said, his voice even but firm, "come with me." Lauren blinked, suddenly feeling uneasy. She had worked under Richard for almost 2 years, and he rarely called anyone out like this. She hesitated, then forced a smirk, trying to play it off. "What's up, boss?" Richard didn't answer. He just turned and walked back out toward the dining area. Lauren swallowed hard, her heart picking up speed. Something about the way he moved, the way he hadn't even looked at her directly, sent a cold feeling down her spine. She followed him through the kitchen doors, stepping back into the main restaurant. The moment she emerged, she noticed something was different. The energy had shifted. Customers were looking in her direction. Some were whispering. Even the other servers were glancing at her, their faces unreadable. And then she saw Ethan. He was still seated at his table, his posture relaxed, but his expression was sharp, watching everything unfold with quiet patience. Lauren's stomach twisted. Richard stopped near Ethan's table and finally turned to face her. His eyes, usually calm and professional, were now cold and unreadable. "Care to explain why this gentleman has been sitting here for nearly 30 minutes without being served?" The restaurant fell silent. Even the background music seemed quieter. Lauren's mouth went dry. For the first time all night, she had nothing to say. Lauren felt every pair of eyes in the restaurant on her. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she forced a smile, trying to appear unfazed. "I was just busy," she said quickly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I had other tables to take care of." Richard didn't blink. "You mean the ones you served immediately while ignoring this one?" His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in his words. Lauren let out a dry laugh. "Oh, come on. It's not like that." She turned to Ethan, who was still watching her in silence. "You saw how busy we were, right? It wasn't personal." Ethan arched an eyebrow but said nothing. His silence was louder than words. Richard's jaw tightened. "Really? Because I've been watching, and it sure looked personal to me." A few waitstaff shifted uncomfortably in the background. Olivia glanced down at the notepad in her hands, her grip tightening. Madison folded her arms, stealing a glance at Lauren before quickly looking away. Lauren swallowed. She could feel herself losing control of the situation. She needed to turn this around. "I didn't think he was ready to order," she tried again. "I mean, he was just sitting there, looking at the menu. I didn't want to rush him." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "So you didn't want to rush him, but you walked past his table multiple times and took orders from customers who arrived after him?" Lauren opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The truth was right there, hanging in the air for everyone to see. Madison exhaled, shaking her head. "You didn't even bring him water," she muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. That was the final blow. A few customers exchanged glances. Some whispered quietly. A man at a nearby table frowned, setting down his fork. Lauren's cheeks burned. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Richard let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. Then he turned to Ethan. "Sir, I'd like to personally apologize for the way you've been treated tonight." His voice was firm but respectful. "That's not how we do things here." Ethan finally spoke, his voice even. "It seems like it was how she does things." Lauren felt her stomach drop. Richard nodded. "You're absolutely right." He turned back to Lauren, his expression unreadable. "Come with me. Now." Lauren's breath hitched. The cold feeling in her chest spread, but she forced herself to keep walking as Richard led the way. The whispers followed her as she moved through the restaurant. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she had a bad feeling that she was about to find out. Lauren followed Richard through the restaurant, her heart pounding harder with each step. The glances from customers and staff made her skin prickle, but she kept her chin up, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. They passed through a hallway near the manager's office, where the sounds of the dining area faded slightly. Richard finally stopped and turned to face her, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but the weight in his eyes made her uneasy. "You're going to tell me the truth," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "Why didn't you serve him?" Lauren let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. "I told you, I was busy. It wasn't intentional." Richard didn't react. He just stared at her, waiting. Lauren shifted under his gaze. "I mean, look, some customers fit this place better than others," she added, her tone lowering slightly. "You know the kind of crowd we cater to. I was just trying to—" "Stop." Richard's voice cut through her excuse like a blade. Lauren's mouth snapped shut. Richard exhaled slowly, as if trying to rein in his frustration. "Do you hear yourself right now? Do you realize what you just admitted?" Lauren's face flushed. "I didn't mean it like that." "Oh, I think you did." Richard's voice stayed calm, but the edge was there. "And you thought no one would notice?" Lauren's pulse raced. "It's not a big deal," she muttered, crossing her arms. "You're making it into one." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not a big deal?" He shook his head. "Ignoring a paying customer, making him feel unwelcome, and then acting like it's justified? That's not just a big deal. That's a fireable offense." Lauren's breath hitched. "Wait, what?" "You heard me." Richard's tone left no room for argument. Panic flickered across Lauren's face. "You can't be serious." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then gestured toward the dining room. Do you think I can ignore what just happened out there? Half the restaurant saw it. Our own staff saw it. If I let this slide, what kind of message does that send? Lauren's hands clenched into fists. I've worked here for 2 years, she said, her voice rising. You can't just throw me out over this. Richard arched an eyebrow. I can and I will. Lauren's chest rose and fell quickly. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Richard took a step closer. Now I'll give you two options, he continued. You can either leave quietly, or we can do this in front of the entire restaurant. Your choice. Lauren's face turned red. You wouldn't? Try me, Richard interrupted. For the first time, real fear crossed Lauren's face. Her grip on her apron tightened. She glanced toward the door leading back to the dining area, where customers were still seated, waiters moving around them. She imagined the humiliation of being dragged out in front of them. The whispers, the stares. She swallowed hard. This wasn't going the way she had expected. Not at all. Lauren's breathing was uneven as she stared at Richard, trying to process what was happening. She had walked into this conversation thinking she could talk her way out of it, maybe even twist things in her favor. But now, standing in front of the man who held her job in his hands, she realized there was no escape. She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. You're really going to do this? Over one customer? Richard's expression didn't change. No, he said. I'm doing this because of how you treated that customer. And judging by how easily you dismissed it, I have a feeling this isn't the first time. Lauren's jaw clenched. That's ridiculous. Richard tilted his head slightly. Is it? She could feel the walls closing in. She thought about arguing, thought about demanding another chance, but the look in his eyes told her it was pointless. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Lauren's stomach turned when she saw Olivia Daniels step forward hesitantly. Behind her, Madison Clark followed, looking more confident. Both of them stopped just a few feet away, exchanging quick glances before Olivia cleared her throat. Richard, Olivia said, her voice careful. I just wanted to say, what happened out there? It wasn't the first time. Lauren's head snapped toward her. Excuse me? Olivia hesitated but didn't back down. I've seen it before. She skipped tables, ignored certain customers. Her voice softened slightly. I didn't say anything because, well, I didn't know if anyone would believe me. Madison nodded. I saw it too, she added. More than once. Lauren's pulse pounded in her ears. You little... Enough! Richard's voice cut through Lauren's anger like a blade. His expression had darkened now, his patience completely gone. He turned back to Lauren. That settles it. Lauren shook her head frantically. This is insane. You're going to believe them over me? Richard's stare was cold. I don't have to believe them. I saw it myself. A heavy silence filled the air. Lauren's throat went dry. The realization hit her like a truck. It was over. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had nothing left to say. Richard exhaled, then stepped aside, motioning toward the back exit. Get your things and leave. Lauren's hands balled into fists. Her entire body trembled with anger and humiliation. But she had no choice. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the employee lockers. She didn't look back. But if she had, she would have seen the way Madison and Olivia stood taller, the way Richard's shoulders relaxed just slightly. And at the front of the restaurant, seated at his table, Ethan Carter watched it all happen, his face calm, his expression unreadable. The night wasn't over yet, but for Lauren, it had just ended. Lauren stormed into the employee break room, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she yanked open her locker. The metal door slammed against the side, rattling loudly in the empty space. Her fingers fumbled as she grabbed her purse, her thoughts racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had worked here for 2 years. She knew how things worked. She had seen others cut corners, ignore tables, even mess up orders. And no one had ever been fired on the spot. So why was she the one being thrown out like garbage? Her hands shook as she shoved her phone into her bag. She clenched her jaw, trying to push down the rising frustration in her chest. Then the door swung open. Lauren turned sharply, expecting Richard, ready to argue one last time. But instead, Madison Clark stood in the doorway, arms crossed. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. Madison leaned against the wall, watching Lauren with a look that wasn't quite smug but wasn't sympathetic either. "You really thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "Get away with what?" she snapped. Madison let out a short, humorless laugh. "With treating people like that, ignoring them like they didn't matter, like you got to decide who deserved respect and who didn't." Lauren rolled her eyes and slung her bag over her shoulder. "Spare me the speech." She brushed past Madison, but Madison didn't move. "You know what's funny?" Madison said, tilting her head slightly. "If you had just treated him like any other customer, none of this would have happened. You'd still have your job." Lauren whipped around. "Oh, please." Her voice dripped with frustration. "Like you've never judged someone the second they walked in." Madison's eyes narrowed. "Maybe I have, but I didn't let it dictate how I treated them." Lauren's fingers curled into fists. This was humiliating. Being lectured like she was some kind of child. Being forced to walk out like a failure while Madison, Olivia, and the others got to stand around feeling proud of themselves. She turned back toward the door. "I don't have to listen to this." Madison shrugged. "No, you don't. But you'll remember it." Lauren bit the inside of her cheek, pushing past her and walking down the hall. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached the back door, she hesitated for just a second. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march back in there and demand they take her seriously, but no one would. She had already lost. With a final frustrated breath, she pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit her like a slap. And just like that, Lauren Mitchell was no longer a waitress at Bennett's Steakhouse. Lauren's heels clicked against the pavement as she stomped toward her car, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The night air was sharp, colder than she expected, but the anger burning inside her was hotter than anything the wind could throw at her. Her jaw clenched so tightly it ached, and her thoughts spun in circles. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She had built herself up in this restaurant, earned her place, and now she was being tossed out like a piece of trash over one customer, over one mistake. No, this wasn't fair. This wasn't right. Reaching her car, she yanked open the door, throwing her bag onto the passenger seat before gripping the steering wheel with both hands. Her knuckles turned white as she stared through the windshield, her breath shaky. She could still see the glow of the restaurant's lights in her rearview mirror. People were still inside, still eating, still laughing. It felt unreal, like the world should have stopped the moment she was fired. But it didn't. No one was coming outside to stop her. No one was going to fight for her. Her pulse quickened at the thought. Didn't they realize what they had done? Didn't they understand what kind of mistake they had just made? Lauren grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling with frustration as she scrolled through her contacts. She hovered over a familiar number, her friend Megan, another waitress at a different restaurant across town. Megan always had something to say, always knew how to twist things in her favor. Maybe she'd know what to do. Maybe she could help her figure out how to fix this. She hesitated. Fix this how? Richard hadn't given her a warning. He hadn't told her to take a break and cool off. He had fired her on the spot. That wasn't something she could just fix. Her stomach twisted, and she nearly threw her phone onto the seat beside her. This was all Ethan Carter's fault. She had been working there for 2 years, and now, because of him, she was jobless. If he had just been patient, if he had just waited like everyone else, none of this would have happened. But no, he had to sit there, acting all calm and superior, watching her downfall like he had been planning it from the start. Her fingers dug into the leather of her steering wheel as her mind raced. Had he done this on purpose? The way he had sat there, the way he had looked at her, so steady, so confident, like he already knew how it would end. Lauren scoffed under her breath. No, that was ridiculous. He wasn't important. He wasn't anyone. He was just some guy who got lucky because the manager happened to be watching. And yet, something about the way he had carried himself, the way he had barely reacted to her behavior, it nagged at her. Like he had expected her to act that way. Like he had been waiting for it. Lauren shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter. It wasn't like she was ever going to see him again. She needed to figure out what to do next. Taking a deep breath, she turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and she gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady herself. But no matter how much she told herself to move on, to let it go, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. What if Ethan Carter wasn't just another customer? What if he was someone who could ruin more than just her job? Lauren gripped the steering wheel, her mind still spinning with frustration and disbelief. She couldn't just sit there, letting the reality of her situation sink in. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. How could Richard fire her like that? Just like that? Without a second chance? Without a warning? 2 years of work, gone. And all because of him, Ethan Carter. His name left a sour taste in her mouth. She had never seen him before tonight, but the way he had just sat there, calm and patient, watching everything unfold like he already knew how the night would end, it unsettled her. He hadn't even raised his voice. He hadn't demanded anything. He had just let Richard do the work for him. It didn't make sense. Lauren had seen plenty of unhappy customers in the past. Some had yelled, some had left nasty reviews, and some had even demanded to speak to the owner. But Ethan? He had done none of that. He had simply waited. Like he knew. Lauren's grip tightened. She glanced back toward the restaurant. Through the large windows, she could still see the warm lights, the servers moving between tables, and at the far corner, Ethan was still sitting at his table. He hadn't left. That alone sent another wave of unease through her. Most people would have walked out the moment they saw someone fired over them. Most people would have at least looked uncomfortable. But Ethan? He was completely unbothered. Lauren clenched her jaw. She didn't know why, but something about that bothered her more than being fired. She looked down at her phone again, her fingers hovering over the screen. Should she call Megan? Should she text Richard and demand he reconsider? No. She knew how that would go. Richard had made up his mind. If she pushed him now, it would only make things worse. Her heart pounded as another thought crept into her mind. Who was Ethan Carter? She didn't know anything about him. She hadn't seen him before at the restaurant. But there was something about the way he held himself, the way he had remained so unshaken by everything. Even when she had ignored him, even when she had snapped at Olivia for trying to serve him, he hadn't reacted like a normal customer would. He had just waited. Lauren frowned, tapping her nails against her phone. Was he one of those corporate mystery diners? Some kind of reviewer? No, that didn't feel right. If that were the case, wouldn't he have taken notes, asked more questions, tested the service across multiple waiters? She stared at him through the glass, watching as he finally stood up. He moved like someone who wasn't in a hurry, someone who had gotten exactly what they came for. Her stomach twisted again. He walked toward the front desk, and as soon as he did, Richard himself came out from the back to speak with him. Lauren's breath hitched. That wasn't normal. Richard barely spoke to customers directly unless something really serious had happened. Usually managers handled things, not the owner himself. But there he was, talking to Ethan like they knew each other. Lauren's mouth went dry. Something wasn't right. She leaned forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out their conversation through the glass. She couldn't hear them, but the way Richard was nodding, the way Ethan was speaking in that same calm, composed manner, it sent a shiver down her spine. Then Richard shook Ethan's hand. Lauren's fingers twitched. No, no, no. She had never seen Richard shake a customer's hand like that. It wasn't just a polite thank you. It was something else, something important. And that was when the realization hit her like a freight train. Ethan Carter wasn't just some customer. He was someone with power. Lauren's pulse raced as Ethan turned, walking toward the exit. Her instinct screamed at her. She needed to find out who he really was, before it was too late. Lauren's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, her mind racing faster than she could keep up with. She wasn't the type to overthink things. She acted first and dealt with the consequences later. But this wasn't something she could brush off. Something about Ethan Carter wasn't normal. Her breath hitched as she watched through the windshield. Ethan walked toward the exit of the restaurant, still moving with that same controlled, effortless confidence. The way Richard had shaken his hand, The way they had spoken so calmly, it felt planned. Lauren's stomach twisted. Was this a setup? Had Richard planned to fire her all along? Had Ethan been sent here to test the staff? No, that didn't make sense. Richard wasn't the kind of boss to play games. But then, why was he acting so formal with a man he was supposed to be apologizing to? Lauren's heart pounded against her ribs as she quickly unlocked her phone and opened the browser. Her fingers were shaky as she typed, "Ethan Carter business?" A list of search results popped up. Most of them seemed random, LinkedIn profiles, social media pages, but one article caught her eye. Ethan Carter, the quiet investor shaping major restaurant chains. Lauren's stomach dropped. She clicked the link, and as soon as the page loaded, a photo stared back at her, a photo of the same man she had ignored tonight. Her throat tightened as she skimmed the article. Ethan Carter wasn't just some customer. He was one of the biggest investors in the restaurant industry. He had stakes in multiple high-end dining chains, often visiting locations unannounced to assess their service and management. He never made his presence known, never flaunted his wealth, he simply observed. And then, he made decisions that changed everything. Lauren's hands went cold. This wasn't just about her losing her job. This was about something much, much bigger. She scrolled down, her eyes darting across the article. It mentioned how Ethan had been known to make or break restaurants based on his experiences. Some places he had invested in skyrocketed in value after his involvement. Others? They collapsed within months, because if he didn't like what he saw, he pulled his money. Lauren's breath hitched, her heart hammered as she looked back up, just in time to see Ethan walking toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. A driver stood nearby, holding the door open for him. She had been so stupid. She had treated him like a nobody, like he wasn't worth her time, like he was beneath her. And now he held the future of the restaurant in his hands. If he decided to cut ties with Richard's Steakhouse, it wouldn't just be her losing a job. The entire place could go under. And she had just handed him the perfect reason to do it. Her breathing turned shallow. Could she fix this? Could she stop whatever was coming? Lauren's fingers hovered over her phone again, debating whether to call Richard, whether to beg, whether to apologize, whether to find some way to turn this around. But before she could make a decision, something happened that made her blood run cold. Ethan paused before stepping into his car, and for the first time that night, he looked directly at her. Not just a glance, not just a quick flicker of recognition, a knowing look, like he was aware she had figured it out, like he had been expecting it. Lauren's breath caught in her throat, and then without a word, Ethan got into his car. The door shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Lauren sat frozen in her car, gripping the phone in her lap, her thoughts spiraling into panic. Because now, one terrifying thought was clear. This wasn't just about tonight. Whatever happened next was already in motion. Lauren sat motionless in her car, her breathing uneven as she stared at the spot where Ethan's car had just been. The taillights had disappeared into the distance, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach only grew stronger. She had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and she knew it. But the worst part, she didn't know how bad it was going to get. Her hands shook as she finally set her phone down, her thoughts spinning wildly. There had to be a way out of this. Maybe Richard hadn't known who Ethan was either. Maybe Ethan wasn't planning to do anything drastic. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as serious as she thought. But then another thought crept in. What if it was worse than she imagined? What if Ethan had been sent specifically because of people like her? What if Richard did know? What if the restaurant had already been under review and she had just given Ethan Carter the perfect reason to pull his investment? Lauren's chest tightened. This wasn't just about her job anymore. If Ethan decided the restaurant wasn't worth saving, the fallout wouldn't stop with her. Servers, cooks, bartenders, dishwashers, the people she had worked with for years, they would all be at risk, and she would be the reason for it. Her stomach twisted as the reality set in. She could already picture it. Richard calling an emergency staff meeting, the way the whispers would spread, the way everyone would look at her when they realized what she had done. Would they hate her? Would they blame her? Her phone vibrated suddenly, making her jump. She snatched it up, her heart racing as she saw a message from Megan, the friend she had almost called earlier. Megan. Girl, what happened? I just saw your name in the group chat. Are you okay? Lauren's blood went cold. She quickly opened the restaurant's employee chat, scrolling past messages of co-workers discussing shifts, schedules, and customer complaints, until she saw it. A message from Madison. Madison. So in case anyone missed it, Lauren got fired tonight. Lauren's stomach dropped. The replies flooded in. Jason, head chef. Wait, for real? What happened? Olivia. Yeah, it was bad. She got caught skipping tables, and Richard fired her on the spot. Andrew, bartender. Damn, didn't think Richard had it in him to do that so fast. Sophia, server. It wasn't just any table. A pause. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she watched the chat refresh. Sophia. She ignored Ethan Carter. The chat exploded. Jason. Wait, the Ethan Carter? Andrew. No freaking way. That was him. Madison. Yup. And she ignored him. Straight up refused to serve him. Lauren felt like she was going to be sick. They all knew, not just that she was fired, but who Ethan was. She barely had time to process it before another message popped up. Richard. Staff meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mandatory. Lauren's vision blurred as she read the words again. It was happening. She had set something in motion, and now it was out of her hands. Her grip tightened around her phone as her thoughts spiraled into panic. She had to fix this, somehow, some way, before it was too late. Lauren stared at her phone, her pulse thudding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to do something, to respond, to defend herself, to explain. But what was there to say? Her co-workers already knew. They had seen it happen. No amount of excuses or justifications would change the fact that she had messed up. And now the whole restaurant was about to feel the consequences. Her throat tightened as she scrolled through the chat, watching the messages pile up. Jason. If Carter pulls his investment, we're screwed. That guy basically saved the downtown steakhouse after their numbers dropped last year. Andrew. I heard he shut down an entire restaurant chain in under 6 months after he found out the management was corrupt. Olivia. That's the thing, though. He doesn't just fire people. He changes everything. If he's still interested in this place, we might get lucky. But if he's not… Lauren's heart pounded as she reread the words. We might get lucky. As if the entire fate of the restaurant, her co-workers' jobs, the staff who had nothing to do with what happened, depended on one man's decision, and she had given him every reason to walk away. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had to get ahead of this. Quickly, she tapped on Richard's contact, hesitating only a second before pressing call. The phone rang twice before he picked up. Lauren, Richard's voice was sharp, his tone carrying none of the patience he'd shown earlier that night. I assume you saw the staff chat? She swallowed. Yeah, I did. A long silence followed. Look, she rushed, gripping the steering wheel. I know I screwed up. I know I should have just taken his order and moved on, but I didn't know who he was. It doesn't matter who he was, Lauren. Richard cut her off. You don't treat people that way. Period. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Do you have any idea how bad this could get? Richard continued. I mean, really, do you? Because right now I'm about to walk into a meeting with the restaurant's board in the morning and try to explain why one of my employees thought it was acceptable to ignore a paying customer because they didn't fit the image. Lauren flinched. She had said those words. This place has an image to maintain, without thinking much of it at the time. Now hearing them thrown back at her, it sounded worse than she remembered. I was just doing what I thought was best, she muttered. What was best? Richard scoffed. Lauren, he's not just a rich investor. He's one of the most influential figures in the industry. You think people won't hear about this? You think it won't spread? If Ethan Carter decides we're not worth saving, I guarantee you no serious investor will touch this restaurant again. A cold weight settled in Lauren's chest. It wasn't just about Ethan Carter pulling his money. It was about reputation. If word got out that their restaurant mistreated customers, that a high-profile investor had personally witnessed it and walked away, it wouldn't just be one man's decision. Other investors would follow. No one would take the risk. Lauren's stomach churned. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Richard sighed. "I don't know. But what I do know is that tomorrow's meeting is going to determine a lot. And if I were you, I'd stay as far away from it as possible." Lauren's fingers clenched into fists. "There has to be something I can do. I can talk to him. I can explain." "You think that'll change his mind?" Richard snapped. "You think saying sorry is enough to make a man like Ethan Carter forget what happened?" Lauren swallowed. "You want to fix this?" Richard said, his voice dropping lower. "Then I suggest you figure out how to prove that you're not the person he thinks you are. Because if you don't, then by the time this is over, no restaurant in this city will ever hire you again." Lauren felt like the air had been knocked out of her. "Good night, Lauren," Richard said. And then the line went dead. She sat frozen in her car, the phone slipping from her hand into her lap. Her mind screamed at her to do something, to find a way out of this. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't know how, because Richard was right. Ethan Carter wasn't just any customer. And fixing this, it would take more than an apology. Lauren sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached. The weight of Richard's words pressed down on her like an unbearable force, making it hard to breathe. No restaurant in this city will ever hire you again. She had never thought about the long-term consequences of her actions. In her mind, she had been untouchable, one of the senior waitresses, respected, or so she thought, and good at her job. A mistake like this, it was supposed to blow over, not destroy her career. But Ethan Carter wasn't just any customer, and she wasn't just dealing with a bad review or a disciplinary warning. This was different. Her phone was still in her lap, the screen glowing faintly. The restaurant's employee chat was still active, messages piling up from her former coworkers. She knew what they were saying. She didn't have to look. They were talking about her. Some of them were probably relieved. Others were just curious. But the worst part? Not one person had messaged her privately to check if she was okay. Not one. A hollow feeling settled in her chest. Had they really hated her that much? Or worse, had she just never realized how replaceable she was? She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to sting. This wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan Carter had watched her fall, and now she had to find a way to stand back up. Lauren pulled up his name in the search bar again, scrolling past articles, looking for something, anything, that could help her understand him better. She needed to know who he was beyond the money, beyond the power. She needed to know what kind of person she was dealing with. A headline caught her eye. "Ethan Carter, the silent architect behind the industry's biggest shifts." Lauren clicked on it, scanning the paragraphs quickly. The article talked about his investment strategies, his ability to spot failing businesses and turn them around, and how he never gave second chances to places that proved unworthy of his time. She swallowed hard at that last part. He was known for giving opportunities to those who deserved it. But if he decided someone wasn't worth it, he cut them off completely. No second chances, no redemption, just gone. Lauren's stomach twisted. That meant there was a chance, a slim one, but still a chance, that she could change his perception. But how? She had no way to contact him, no way to explain herself. And even if she did, what could she possibly say that would make a man like Ethan Carter listen? Then another thought hit her. Richard had said something earlier. Tomorrow's meeting is going to determine a lot. Her breath caught. Ethan wasn't done with the restaurant yet. If he were, he would have left, sent a formal notice through his lawyers, and that would be it. But he hadn't, which meant he was still considering his next move. Lauren sat up straighter. She knew exactly what she had to do. She needed to get into that meeting. If Ethan Carter was going to decide the fate of the restaurant, she had to be there, to see it happen, to make him look her in the eye when he made his decision. Because if she could just get him to listen, to hear her side, to see that she wasn't just a lost cause, maybe, just maybe, she could change her fate. Lauren took a deep breath and started the car. Tomorrow she wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the consequences. She was going to face them head on. Lauren barely slept that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind trapped in an endless cycle of thoughts, regrets, and desperate ideas. No matter how she spun it, the truth was simple. She had to find a way into that meeting. But how? She wasn't an employee anymore. Richard had made that painfully clear. The moment she stepped inside the restaurant, security, or worse, Richard himself, would probably throw her out before she got within 10 feet of Ethan Carter. But she wasn't about to let that stop her. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, she had a plan. She got up, dressed quickly, and left her apartment without touching the untouched cup of coffee sitting on the counter. There was no time for breakfast. Her stomach was in knots anyway. As she drove toward the restaurant, her mind kept replaying Ethan's face, the calm, knowing expression, the way he had looked at her before getting into his car. He had known she would figure it out, but had he expected her to give up? Not a chance. When she pulled into the parking lot, she saw that she wasn't the only one who had arrived early. Several employees were already there, standing in small groups outside, whispering amongst themselves. The tension was obvious. They all knew today was going to decide their futures. Lauren sat in her car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Then she spotted Richard standing near the entrance, talking to Madison and Jason. They looked tense. Madison nodded at something Richard said, then glanced toward the parking lot, toward her. Lauren quickly turned her head away. No doubt they were talking about her. It didn't matter. She wasn't here for them. She waited until Richard and the others disappeared inside before she made her move. Lauren slipped out of the car, keeping her head low, and walked quickly toward the side entrance, the one that staff used to come in and out for smoke breaks. She had been through this door hundreds of times. She knew the exact moment the lock was disengaged for deliveries. As she approached, she spotted a dishwasher, Carlos leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Her heart pounded. Carlos had never liked her much. He had always thought she was arrogant, but he also wasn't the type to get involved in things that didn't concern him. She took a breath and walked up to him. "Hey, Carlos," she said, forcing a casual smile. Carlos glanced up, surprised. You're not supposed to be here." "I know," she admitted, keeping her voice low. "But I need a favor. A small one." Carlos frowned. "You got fired, Lauren. What are you even doing here?" She leaned in slightly. "I just need to get inside for 5 minutes. Just long enough to hear what's going on in the meeting." Carlos blinked. "You want me to, what, sneak you in?" No, she said quickly. "Just don't say anything if I walk in." Carlos hesitated. He looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. "You're gonna get yourself in trouble." Lauren let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I think I already passed that point." Carlos sighed, rubbing the back of his head. "You better be quick." Lauren exhaled in relief. "I will be, I swear." He muttered something under his breath and pushed the door open wider. "Go, before I change my mind." She didn't waste a second. Slipping inside, Lauren moved swiftly down the back hallway, heart pounding as she approached the doors leading to the private dining room where the meeting was being held. She recognized the voices immediately. Richard's firm but stressed tone, Madison's quiet agreement, Jason's usual bluntness. And then there was Ethan Carter. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried weight. "You need to understand," Ethan was saying, "this isn't just about one bad employee. It's about the culture of the restaurant. If one person felt comfortable acting that way, how many others have done the same when no one was watching?" Lauren's stomach dropped. He wasn't just talking about her. He was questioning the entire workplace environment. If he decided that the restaurant was beyond saving, it wouldn't be just her out of a job. Everyone would be. She moved carefully, positioning herself near the door, just close enough to hear every word. Richard sighed. "I won't make excuses for what happened. It was unacceptable, and she's no longer with us because of it." Lauren flinched. "Firing one person isn't the same as fixing the problem," Ethan replied smoothly. "Tell me, Richard, if I invest in this place, what's stopping something like this from happening again?" Silence. Lauren pressed her back against the wall, her breathing shallow. Richard didn't have an answer, and Ethan knew it. If Lauren didn't act soon, there might not be a restaurant left to save. She had one chance to change the narrative, one chance to make Ethan Carter look at her and see something more than a mistake. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the door handle. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she pushed it open. All eyes snapped to her. The room went silent. Ethan Carter turned in his chair, his gaze locking onto hers. No surprise, no shock, just quiet curiosity, like he had been waiting for her all along. Lauren swallowed, forcing herself to stand taller. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to grovel. She was going to fight. "I think you're asking the wrong question," she said, her voice steady. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Lauren nodded. "You're asking Richard how he'll fix this. But I think what you should be asking is, how will I?" Silence stretched across the room. And for the first time all night, Ethan Carter smiled, like he was interested in what she had to say. The room was so silent that Lauren could hear the distant hum of the kitchen appliances. Every eye was on her. Richard's expression was unreadable, but there was clear tension in the way he sat back, arms crossed, waiting to see how this would play out. Madison and Jason exchanged uneasy glances. They had been part of the meeting long enough to know that Ethan Carter was not a man who tolerated distractions. And then there was Ethan himself. He studied Lauren with that same quiet patience, the same steady control he had shown all night. His expression didn't give anything away, but something in his eyes told her that he wasn't dismissing her just yet. Lauren's pulse pounded, but she kept her posture straight. She had forced her way in here. Now she had to prove she deserved to stay. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Go on then," he said, his voice calm. "I'm listening." Lauren took a slow breath, steadying herself. "You're right," she said, her voice even. "Firing one person doesn't fix a company. It doesn't change a system. It doesn't erase the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. But if you think getting rid of me means the problem is solved, then you're wrong." Madison's lips parted slightly, surprised at her boldness. Jason leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Lauren didn't stop. "I made a mistake, a big one. I won't sit here and pretend that what I did was okay, or that I don't deserve the consequences. But I also know that the way this restaurant runs, the way some people get treated differently than others, I'm not the only one responsible for that." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Ethan didn't blink. "So what are you saying?" Lauren exhaled. "I'm saying if you want to fix this place, you don't just need a new set of rules. You need people who are willing to change, people who are willing to face what they did wrong and do better. And you're looking at one of them." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the table. "And why should I believe you?" Lauren swallowed. She had expected this question, but answering it was harder than she thought, because she didn't have an easy answer. Finally, she spoke. "Because I don't want my legacy in this place to be the mistake I made last night," she admitted. "I want to be better than that. And if I walk away right now, then nothing changes. I'll be just another person who got fired, and you'll be just another investor who walked away. But if you want real change, you don't just cut out the problem and move on. You stay and fix it." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, something in Ethan's expression shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Richard finally spoke, his voice measured. "Lauren, you don't even work here anymore." "Then hire me back," she said without hesitation. "Not because I deserve it, but because I'm the only one in this room who actually knows what's wrong with this restaurant from the inside out." She gestured toward the other employees. "You want to make this place better? Let me help do that." Richard stared at her for a long moment. Madison was watching her with something almost close to admiration. Even Jason, who rarely took anyone's side, looked impressed. But none of them mattered. Only Ethan Carter's decision did. Finally, he exhaled slowly and sat forward, lacing his fingers together on the table. "You're bold," he said. "I like that." Lauren held her breath. But words mean nothing if actions don't follow. Her heart clenched. "So here's my offer," Ethan continued. "I'm not going to walk away from this restaurant. Not yet. but I'm also not offering you a free pass. Lauren nodded, barely breathing. Understood. You want a second chance? Ethan said, his gaze sharp. Then earn it. Work your way back up from the bottom. Not as a senior waitress. Not even as a waitress. She froze. If you want back in, he continued, you start where you should have started in the first place, as a busser. Madison gasped quietly. Lauren felt her stomach twist. Bussers were at the bottom of the hierarchy. They cleaned tables, washed dishes, ran food. They took orders from the very same people she used to work alongside. It was humiliating. It was brutal. And it was exactly what she deserved. She met Ethan's eyes. For how long? Ethan smirked slightly, the first real sign of amusement he had shown all night. As long as it takes for you to prove that you've changed. Lauren's throat was dry. Her pride screamed at her to walk away. But she had fought too hard to back down now. She nodded once. Deal. Ethan extended a hand across the table. Then welcome back to the team, Lauren. Let's see what you're really made of. Lauren reached out, her fingers gripping his hand as she shook it. And just like that, her fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. What do you think? Did Lauren deserve a second chance? Or was Ethan Carter too easy on her? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to see it.